started now. So did everybody enjoy their evening last night? Everyone's awake, 9 a.m., ready to go. Woohoo! Ready to learn about project server and project client development? Awesome. So my name's Chris Boyd. I am a program manager on the engineering team for project, and I'm joined today with Eli, who's also a program manager. So for today, our plan is to first kind of give a quick overview of what project is. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are familiar with project server? Okay, quite a few. That's good. What about project client? Quite a few too. Awesome. Awesome. So we'll do a very quick 5,000 kind of foot view of what we've done in this release and kind of skim over it very quickly. There's a lot of other sessions going on that covers kind of the end user functionality in a lot of depth. The next we'll follow through on going over extending project server and going over the architecture and various ways that you can customize it and build add-on apps for project server. And then the last third, we'll spend some time going over client development and how you can fit project client within SharePoint and building an app that go together. So, business challenges. So the way that I'm going to kind of speak to this slide is kind of my perspective or my viewpoint of what we kind of set out to build in this release. One of our top priorities was to get project running for both client and server in the Office 365 environment and getting it online. You may not think from a developer this is a big deal, especially if you have on-prem deployments, but I think it really is. There's lots of cool things that we had to do to make sure that we could stand up this service and make sure that we can run it and maintain it on a day-to-day basis. And that actually helps you guys build tools on top of project. So in terms of like event logging and ULS logging, we've done a huge amount of investment there. Another kind of exciting thing is Dev Dashboard. So if you're familiar with SharePoint development and you're using Dev Dashboard, in 2010, you may have noticed that when you were hitting things against the project server APIs, that our stuff wouldn't show up in Dev Dashboard. You really wouldn't be able to get a good, clear trace on what's happening. In 2013, everything flows through that system. So you can load up Dev Dashboard and see what's going on. Another kind of big thing that we saw as a challenge was just fitting better with SharePoint. So if you're coming from the SharePoint side, you'll see that Project Server continues to make that progression to feel and look and be just like SharePoint and just be this natural thing you add on to manage your projects. Which brings me kind of to my next slide, which is what's new and the exciting things that are new. So kind of starting with the getting started. Like I said, we're built on top of SharePoint in terms of our server offering. So if you're familiar with SharePoint and the UI paradigms, they carry and flow through when you add project to SharePoint. In addition to that, like our client is part of the Office suite. So if you're used to working with Word and Excel, you can transfer those skill sets over to help you quickly get started. On top of that, we've also built some great getting started experiences. So when you boot up your client, you'll see that you get some nice helpful ways to navigate and start making use of it. Similar to the server, you'll see that we have a getting started carousel that helps admins get their deployments set up and running and working for them. The other kind of exciting thing is that we've really made the system a lot more flexible. In previous releases, we were fairly rigid in how project fit within a server deployment. And I'm going to touch on this in a lot more detail in my next session, if you're interested, IT Pro, and how you can now kind of naturally add project server into an existing site collection and start aggregating that project data into the EPM system. Collaboration, lots here. I think that's kind of one of Project Server's strong points is being able to collaborate on your projects. A couple cool things that we've done here are things like link integration so that you can quickly from Project Center or Resource Center quickly connect with people that are working on various activities with you. You can quickly suck in that project data and start making decisions and understanding how resource balancing is working and all that great stuff. And then I think the last bullet point here, the last pillar, speaks strongly to developers, and that we've done a lot of work in making sure that this thing is stable, performant, and gives you all that diagnostic information to help you debug and build your applications. So now, done with the 5,000-foot view. Most of you are familiar with Project by the sounds of it, so hopefully you guys have a good understanding. We'll get into extending Project Server. So the first thing I kind of want to touch on is our architecture. So we do match the SharePoint architecture, 3 tiers. You have your SQL tier, your app tier, and your WFE. And then you can have various clients that connect up to the WFE. So browsers is definitely a big one, especially when you're connecting to the PWA site. As I'll show you today, we'll build a SharePoint app that uses the browser to connect and show you EPTs. Big change in this release is that we do support all the major browsers, so IE, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Other big kind of piece that fits in and connects to our service is Project Professional, and Eli is going to go through a code demo and show you how to connect it up to SharePoint. PowerShell, again, developers make use of it. In 2010, we only had a very small handful of commands and ways of interacting with Project Server via PowerShell. This is very different in this release. Again, this goes back to the fact that you guys get to take advantage of the fact that we build a service, even if you're deploying on-prem, because we deploy all of our stuff, and the way that the service works is through our PowerShell. So we have well over 50 individual PowerShell commands that you can leverage within your apps that you build. We then have our traditional third-party apps. So like we've always stated, we support back compat, so you have your app that's running against Project Server against 2007 and 2010. It should continue to work fine against 2013 against the PSI. For on-premise deployments, it's a little different when we get online. The PSIs or our web services, WCF services are not available there. And then lastly, we do take advantage now of SharePoint apps. All these great things you're hearing about the App Store and that, it applies to us also. So we now have our CSOM object model. So all these various clients connect through a number of endpoints. We have our ASPX pages, our web services and WCF endpoints. Again, these are our PSIs, the 20 business objects that we've had for a couple of releases now. One thing we're going to say, hopefully you guys have transitioned over to WCF and moved away from the web services. Those things are going to start going away. So in 2013, hopefully you're definitely onto WCF. And if you're starting new, we want you to move to CSOM and OData. Because how I kind of split up this coloring, it actually means something. So in on-prem, all those endpoints are accessible to you. In the online environment, you'll notice that that's the last two, the blue ones. CSOM and OData is the only accessible endpoint for developers. So going forward, we're pushing people towards that CSOM model. Our various endpoints interact with our business objects. If it's a very quick, easy kind of process, something like saving a resource to the system, we push that data directly to our backend into our database. This is a change from the last release. So our WFE is similar to SharePoint in that it talks to the SQL backend. Heavier workloads, things like scheduling a project plan or running an AD sync, does get pushed to the app tier for those to handle the heavier workload and to offload from the WFE to make sure the web experience stays strong. And they're kind of supported by various services. One of the things that does get pushed to the back end, especially from a developer point of view, is the events. So if you do register an event for things like updating a resource or publishing a project plan, those events get handled by our eventing service that runs on the app tier. So if you're familiar with this in 2007 and 2010, you deployed your event handlers on the app tier box. You take those DLLs and you deploy them and GAC them in every single app server, and then you would register them with your PWA instance for your events to fire. Works great, still works today on-prem. Unfortunately, we're not going to let you deploy your DLLs into our data center. So the way that you can do this going forward, and this is documented pretty well in the SDK, is that we have remote event receivers. So you can write an event handler. It can be running in your data center on your own local boxes. It could be running in Windows Azure. It could be running anywhere in competing offerings. and you'd register your endpoint with the eventing service through the PWA UI, similar to how you would have done it before when you were doing your on-box deployment. We'll go off and we'll call your event handler. Other interesting things just to be aware of, if you're new to Project Server, we do have a queue. Our queue does handle our very heavy workloads. From a developer perspective, the thing you have to be aware of here is that there are asynchronous operations that can take anywhere from seconds to execute to days to months. Hopefully it's not that long. We really hope it's not days and months. We've done a lot of great work, and hopefully we won't see results of days and months. But from a developer perspective, when you're coding, you have to make sure that you understand that there are particular things you'll do on our service that will require you to code around and be defensive around the fact that that operation may not complete immediately. If you were watching the keynote, there's some cool things that have been done with workflow in Azure around SharePoint. That same applies to us. Also, Kia in the back there, I'm going to give him a little bit of a plug right now. He's going to be doing a session on demand management with Sam tomorrow at 5. They're going to go through a lot of detail on the workflow and using all our demand management functionality. And then lastly, we get down to our SQL tier. So every PWA instance spews out a database. Now, if you're familiar with 2007 and 2010, you'll notice that there is a change. We've gone from 4 databases down to 1. And the way that we kind of do this is that we actually schematize our databases. So from a developer perspective, there's a couple things that you have to be aware of here. One, that we still support you accessing the reporting store. So we have this very rich reporting store where you can grab and read all the data that gets aggregated into Project Server, and that still is a supported endpoint. We've named that endpoint conveniently DBO. So the schema is DBO. Most of the time, you don't specify a schema within your queries. If you do, if it was reporting, you probably left it as the default and didn't do any funny reconfiguration. So everything should continue to work fine. The other 3 schemas, which is our draft, published, and archive store, which are used by internal functionality. Again, we discourage you guys from reading that data or using that data because it can change and break with updates, but it's contained in the same database. So the first thing you have to realize is one database. If you're connecting to the reporting store, you now just connect to that single DB and your DBO should work. The second thing that you have to be aware of from a developer point of view is if you added additional tables to that reporting store. So we did support you adding tables and storing your own data into the reporting database. That is still a supported scenario, but we do not copy that data on upgrade. So during the upgrade process, we do combine your 4 databases into one. We go ahead and we make sure all that project data that's within those databases get over to that single consolidated database. However, if you added table foobar for your application and you were using that table within the reporting store, it will be left behind in the reporting database. We do not destroy the 4 databases. We create a brand new one. It will be left behind in the reporting database. And you'll have to do some kind of work to help your users and customers transfer that data over to the new consolidated database. And then just lastly, we are built on SharePoint, so you have the content and config DB in use, but it's not an accessible endpoint. So we kind of think of when you're customizing and building on top of Project Server into 2 kind of categories. I want to make you aware, if you're new to Project Server, there's many ways that you can customize the service without even having to code. We're not really going to get into too much detail today about it, but just want to make sure you're aware that you can do things like adding attributes to projects and resources, similar to adding a column to a list. We use a slightly different language in project land opposed to SharePoint land. We call them custom fields opposed to list columns. There's various ways to change around the views, around our lists of projects and resources, and creating very customized things that show graphical indicators and special formulas that show various data points without any code. I touched on like reporting. We have this rich reporting store where you can connect up using Excel or SRS, SQL reporting services, and build great reports. And then there's a bunch of things you can do in demand management. Again, Kia session. It's a good one to go to learn about that. And then, of course, there's all the coding stuff. So this is kind of going over the 2010 stuff. Still applies in 2013. I just wanted to bring this up if you guys weren't familiar with 2010. But we have our project server interfaces, which are our web services, WCF endpoints, 20 business objects, the eventing service that I talked about, reporting BI, and our demand management workflow. So the new exciting stuff. In terms of customization, part of our demand management, that workflow stuff, in the previous release, we only supported Visual Studio workflows. Now we support SharePoint Designer, which is pretty awesome. We've heard a lot of people wanting that. And we've extended our reporting and improved our reporting story and have a new OData endpoint so that if you are using the online service, you have a way to reach the reporting data. Again, it's also still available in the reporting store for on-prem deployment. And then the more exciting thing, which I think for developers, and I think the biggest new thing for us, is the client-side object model. So we're trying to move towards a similar model to what SharePoint's using in terms of building apps. So we've taken that same kind of paradigm and we've moved it over to Project Server. So now that you can interact and program against Project Server in a similar way that you interact and program against SharePoint. So those skills can easily transfer over to each other. I touched on remote event handlers. So our remote event handling service now will go off to a place like Azure or another service, so you don't have to deploy and put DLLs on your app server box, which should make admins happy. And I think I touched on OData already, and of course, because it's apps, you can take advantage of the SharePoint marketplace and sell your apps in the store. So more on apps. I think the great thing here is that we don't have a different developer story anymore for project. It's the same as SharePoint in terms of apps. So project apps are SharePoint apps. When you go to Visual Studio and you want to start developing your application, you go into the template and you choose SharePoint app, and away you go, because we're just all the same. Now, apps are a little bit different than some of the traditional applications that you build with the PSI. The PSI, typically you do things like big lobby integrations where you move data between SAP or some other time-treating app or Dynamics or TFS. Apps are a little bit more contained. I think we're all fairly familiar now with what the app model is, with the explosion of our phones and Win8 and all that great stuff, so I won't go into too much detail. There's a couple ways that you can host your applications. So yesterday during the keynote, we saw the app being hosted in Azure. Today, I'll show you an app that's hosted in SharePoint, written all in JavaScript. And I think that probably covers off most. Again, I think I touched on the fact that it is part of the Office application store. So the process to submit your app is the same as the SharePoint stuff. So if you go to a SharePoint session around how to submit your app to the Office store, it's the same process. So a few scenarios to cover, trying to get your ideas thinking. One thing that you might want to think about apps, what we see is that Project Server, I think, is a great tool. It provides lots of capability out of box, but it has a lot of scope. And we hear a lot of requests from our user community around, gee, wouldn't it be great to understand and have this methodology apply right out of box, or I want it for this particular vertical for construction or something. And having an apps, this is, I think, a great opportunity, because I don't know if we'll ever really get there, where you could write a bunch of apps that kind of take a Project Server deployment online and then help scope and navigate users through various methodologies. It is possible to do line of business applications. We're not totally scoped out. You can build things that could abstract data from the timesheet and push it into another external system as an app. I think, and we'll show you a quick example around reports and what kind of reports you can build. So you can use the OData service or CSOM to pull data into a web part or some kind of visualization tool, add it to a page in PWA, and help kind of bring insight into how projects are tracking or how resources are being utilized. And kind of going back to the first point around building apps around training and helping users be able to actually use the product. So here's an example from TPG. They are already well on their way of developing a project app. This particular app, shows up just as a part, so it's showing up just under Project Center, and it's tracking various milestones and showing reporting data. So this is just kind of one example of, or idea of what you can do, where you have this thing that shows up on a page and helps pull data in, help make people make decisions and see how things are tracking. So CSOM object model. Again, I want to emphasize this is available both on-prem and online. This is something which we are pushing people towards. It is kind of the way that we kind of see the future of project development, and that's what we're going to recommend that people do. Be totally upfront with you guys. It doesn't have 100% coverage with the PSI, but it covers most of the important entities. If there's something you feel that's strongly missing as you're developing, definitely come in and tell us. We want that kind of feedback of how we can continue to develop it and what the priorities are. I would even recommend using both models congruently. So if it is the case that there is something in CSOM that isn't available and you need access to, go ahead, use the PSIs, but then go back to using CSOM for the things that are available in CSOM. So as we transition over time, you can kind of wean it off of the PSI as we continue to develop it and extend CSOM. So coding, first kind of code example. I just want to show kind of the basic flow of developing a CSOM app, especially for people who aren't too familiar with SharePoint development, but maybe more familiar with project development. So one difference is that you do have to include our CSOM. So you know, here in C#, you have your using statement, add project server client. In JavaScript, I'll show you add a JS file. And that gives us access to all the objects that we can use and interact with project server. The next thing, very similar to SharePoint, you create your context object. Here you're pointing it to a PWA URL. We've made this a little easier on developers, opposed to the PSI where it was like your PWA URL, then you have to remember v_VTI bin_PSI / and then 20 different business objects, and then have to do that 20 different times if you want the full API and different case sensitivity and is it plural or not. Very simple. Want the object model, server/PWA. So once you have your context object, you want to load up your project data. So at this point, we're going to tell the system, here, give me back all the projects and load it up. We don't actually go off to the server and do this. That doesn't happen until we execute this query. Once we execute, the projects get retrieved and away we go. Next, commonly you want to read those objects. So here I'm just iterating over those projects and spewing out the name of the project and the create date of that project. So you start interacting with the object. So kind of the format is, you always get your using statement set up, you do your includes, you create your context object, you load your data, you call execute to retrieve the data from the service, and then you work with that data and continue. So, glad someone's clapping.
Nice.
Wake, yes. A lot different from the PSI. And then one of the nice things, too, is that you can retrieve a lot of data at once in one call, opposed to having to do what you used to have to do. One of my favorite examples was always grabbing a lookup table value for a project where you'd have to call the project PSI, then call the custom field PSI, then call the lookup table PSI, and then go back to the project to get the project value, which is a mess. But we're past that now, and we have CSOM. So here, you guys can download the slide deck. These are all the objects that you can interact with in CSOM. I'm not going to read them out. And I'm going to jump into a demo, and I'm going to hope that the internet's working. If not, I've recorded a video, but I'm hoping I don't have to go to the video. So I built an application that my internal dog fooder wanted. So basically, my dog food user internally, who uses project in our hosted environment to manage all the TAP programs in Microsoft, wanted an easy way for people in his community to quickly create projects. We have this concept called enterprise project types, which based off an EPT, it sets up that project in a particular way. It may apply a template to the project plan, or it sets off and kicks off a workflow. And you can build EPTs without code. This is no customization. And what happens is that you create various EPTs, you get in the nice drop-down menu a way to create these projects. So in this particular system, there's two EPTs defined. There's engineering and marketing. But he kind of found that new users with projects struggled with finding the new menu and going to Project Center. He wanted a kind of, Metro UI, starting carousel way for people to go to a site and kick off their project really quickly so they'd go off. So I'm going to show you that example of how to create a very simple carousel, showing you the EPTs. You click on that various button, and then it will create the project plan. But before we go into the code, I'll show you how you can create an EPT, which is pretty straightforward. Again, no code required. You can do it on the web. You just go to your PWA settings, enterprise project type. You create a new enterprise project type. In this case, I'm going to call it construction. And I got to type it in the field. Construction. Like I said, there's various ways that you can customize this EPT. Here I'm going to specify which pages are associated. So whenever anyone creates my construction project, they'll get a nice schedule page that shows them their schedule when they click on it. But there's tons of options. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to click Save. And this is a very simple way. Now we've categorized and we've created this project categorization where people can now create construction projects within this org. But like I was saying, people sometimes struggle and they want a very easy start experience to creating their plans, and they didn't find this menu quite sufficient enough. So I'm going to build an app to solve that problem. So to build an app, like I said, new project, SharePoint, apps, and you go off and you start and you create your SharePoint app. That's all you did, all I did to get this going. And when you do that, it creates, it builds out this template for you. I didn't have to add any additional files to my template. There's a couple of things I modified. So the default page that loads, just like I was showing you in the C# example, you have to add our object model to it. So here it's ps.debug.das. So it's kind of easy to remember because the template comes with SharePoint. So I'll just copy this line, switch the letters around. Pretty easy, straightforward. When you're done, you can remove the debug, and that will give you the more compressed version of JS opposed to the fully uncompressed debuggable. But since we're going to walk through this, I'm going to leave it on a debug. And then there's a couple other things I did to my default page. One is that I added a table, and this is the table that we're going to populate with our buttons so that each EPT will have a square button and you'll be able to click it. And then just in case a disaster does strike, if we lose a network connection or the queue takes too long to create the project plan, I just have a little bit of goo here that allows me to spit out an error message. So not too much HTML. Just open the default ASPX page. Another slight little customization I made, just to be open, is that there is a cascading style sheet that gets added to your project. Here I just simply added a box so that we get a nice box to give that kind of metro feel to my app. And then really the guts of the application is in our app.js. So I'm going to walk through this code. We'll get it going and we'll walk through it. But before you can actually walk through it, you have to tell the system or tell SharePoint what permissions that your application requires. So you open up the app manifest. There's some nice UI to work through this. And what you'll find when you open up the app manifest is that there are various SharePoint permissions that you can give it. And what you'll notice is that there's project ones in this list. And the project ones, the project one we care about, because we're going to be creating projects here, is manage projects. But if you were interacting with resources or working with a single project, you would set this permission to tell SharePoint this is what this app needs in order to run properly. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start my app. As you notice in the bottom left there, it's deploying it off to SharePoint. So this is running live in our data center. I think this is actually a remote data center too.
Yeah,
so
pretty far away.
This is actually going across the world. We're not doing this out of our North America data center.
So the first time that you install it, it kind of takes the longest if you'd seen the demo yesterday, because it really is kind of setting up all the communication with SharePoint. As you make small code changes to it going forward, the app itself is already registered in SharePoint and is just really changing the code that you've changed. So that was roughly 30 seconds. In the future, you can imagine it being like 5 or 10 seconds to upload the new app.
So what you can see here is that it's informing the end user what permissions you have to give this application in order to run. Beyond the standard SharePoint ones, because we gave it manage projects, you'll see the last bullet point is around managing all projects within this instance. I'm going to go ahead and trust my application. And now we got full debugging. So I'm going to go ahead, and now, so the first step, what we need to do in this app in order to create our carousel of projects, or carousel of EPTs, so that we can create the projects from these EPTs, is to grab the list of enterprise project templates that are defined within the system. So first, I create my context object. So unlike the C# example where I specified the URL, I just said get the current context of the web that we're sitting on, which is our PWA site. And we constructed our project context. Next, what we're going to do is request that we grab the EPTs from the system. We load it, and we specify a query, so you can limit the data that you're getting back. This is similar to what we had in the PSI, where we had this XML on some of the things like resources and custom fields. You can specify which data comes back. This particular filter, though, applies to all objects within our CSOM model, and it's in the same format of filtering that you would use in SharePoint, so that carries through. You don't need to learn something custom. And then lastly, we're going to execute. Now, this particular execute in JavaScript is asynchronous, so we're going to specify 2 callback methods. One is if we're successful, and one is if we fail. If we're successful, we'll go ahead and we'll start creating that table and showing the EPTs to create projects from. If it fails, it will show us that error message in the screen where I had that extra goo to show an error message. So go off. Hopefully we'll get success. We got success, which I'm happy. And then at this point, we're going to just read that EPT object that came back and construct the squares that will show up in the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and just press F5. If we go back to our browser, our app should have loaded. Woohoo! And now we have the carousel that allows you to create projects. And it should read it off, so I'd created construction EPT in front of you guys before. So we had the construction EPT, and then the 2 existing ones that I had defined before the session, engineering and marketing. Go ahead. I'm going to create a project plan. I'm going to use the lovely JavaScript dialog box to pop up so that I can give my project a name. Demo project. And now we're now going to go ahead and we're going to create a project called demo project, and with that EPT, which I believe I clicked on the construction EPT. So to create a project plan, you create a creation info object. You'll see this throughout. So if you need an assignment or task or resource, you create a creation info object. You set various fields. So in this case, we're setting the name and the EPT type. We then grab the project collection, and then we add this particular project to that project collection, and then we call update. Now, what you'll notice is that creating a project is using the queue. So like I described, there are some heavier operations that occur in Project Server that requires that queue. And this is one of them. So here, we're going to call wait for queue, and we're going to say we're specifying 10 seconds. So I'm hopeful this is going to be quite quick. If we're successful, the program runs on and the project gets created, and we'll see it in Project Center. If it fails or it takes too long, I'll again stick out a warning message out on that little goo at the bottom. But I'm faithful that we'll be able to create this project fairly quickly. So I'm going to hit F5. And now it's just reloading the page because it was successful. Let me just get the page going. And now if we go back to PWA from our app, We should have our demo project created using the construction EPT, project center. And there we go, demo project created. Woohoo! Very good. So that's our quick CSOM demo. Very briefly on remote event handlers. I'm not going to go into too much on this. I think I touched. Oh, got to switch over for you guys. I can see it. You can't. Not going to go too much detail because I think I covered this mostly. Again, remember we have a rich eventing story. Fully trusted code continues to work just like it did in 2010, deploying to the app tier. And then online introduces the remote event handlers and being able to call out to a remote service to execute your event handler. And I'd refer you to the SDK if you want more detail on that. So I think this now brings us to our next
Thank you, sir.
piece, which is Project 2013 Client Development, and I'll pass it on to Eli.
Thank you. I want to get a quick show of hands. How many people were at the session yesterday with Keenan and Rolando that went over the kind of high-level apps for Office and apps for SharePoint demos? All right, maybe about half. Okay, a lot of what you'll see here is similar to that, just tailored more for project. One of the demos that he did there was showing Excel and Word connecting to SharePoint. I will show you Project Client connecting to SharePoint Online as well. So the kind of new apps for Office model is essentially a way to bring a web page inside of whatever Office application you're running, be it Word or Excel or Project or PowerPoint. Each of those applications supports some subset of these three apps for Office types. Content apps are ones that are sort of based off of content in the document. This one is what you might find in Excel if you have, for instance, a map or something using some of the data that's really displayed right alongside your data in the application. A task pane app is something you can imagine running sort of to the side of your document. It can interact with data in your document, but isn't really serviced right like inside of that data. It's more of an isolated experience. And a contextual app is mostly used in Alloc, actually. It loads, instead of you choosing when to run it, essentially based on the content in the document, it knows when to run and is based contextually on the data that's there. As I mentioned, we, as Project, only support the task pane app for now. So the other two apps won't really run in Project. But most of the scenarios that we think are most interesting are covered by the task pane app. So these are sort of the details that we have in our apps for Project and how we differ from sort of the overall model. As I said, task pane apps are what we support. We can read all sorts of project data from the document, like your tasks and your resources, what views you're in. We don't have write support yet in our current release. So with Excel and Word, you can actually take data or text inside of the Office app and kind of spit it right into that file. For us, it's mostly a read scenario. And so if you want the user to kind of interact with the document, they really need to do those changes themselves. This is because our data is more structured than Excel or Word, for instance, where they just have text. All of our data is very strongly typed. And so we don't want to really spit just sort of random text into those specifically typed fields. Another difference we have is that we can't bind into the MPP file. And so for instance, you can imagine a Word document or an Excel document. You send it to your friend through email or through SkyDrive. They open it, and they'll see the same app embedded right along in there, assuming they have a license for it. We're not currently supporting sending that same task pane app through the project file. MPP is the file type we use. So a user would need to go and launch it kind of manually from the project client. We do support data and settings persistence through local storage. Essentially, it's sort of like a cookie where if you wanted to save settings from your task pane app, you would save it locally to the user's computer. You could also save it into a SharePoint list, assuming they were connected to SharePoint. Both are fully supported. We have our own set of APIs in our own JavaScript file. This gives you sort of more typed access to things, as I mentioned before, like tasks and resources and project level data, and also which view that the user is in. So you can sort of use these all specifically to know exactly what kind of data you're getting rather than just pulling raw text. We also have events, so you can know when the user changes which task they have selected, which resource they have selected, or if they've changed views. So you can imagine kind of being more contextual with knowing where the user is and what they're trying to do and help them out accordingly. Listed a couple scenarios here just to kind of get you thinking the same way Chris did for SharePoint apps. You can imagine connecting to SharePoint Online, SharePoint on-prem, or Project Server or Project Online right from Project Client. You could use this to kind of surface better cross-project data than you would normally be able to using sort of the out-of-the-box experience. You can imagine loading all of your projects and maybe seeing where a resource is or across all these different projects, showing some sort of graph or chart there. Things that you would normally have to go into PWA, Project Online, Project Server for to see. Now you can do it right in the client. Servicing SharePoint data from project sites. So a lot of the times when you have a project in Project Server, Project Online, you have associated SharePoint pages with it that surface things like issues and risks and also documents related to the current project. This should allow you to expose it much more easily right in the client. So again, you don't have to have a different browser open and do all these things in a new window. And then we also have a scenario where we're actually exposing Project Server data into the other Office applications. So you can imagine a Word app where you're pulling in data right from Project Server or Project Online and generating some sort of Word document with that data without having to do all this crazy copy-paste stuff, as they do allow full write support into those documents. This could also work in Excel or in Outlook. Let's say you want to see some resource availability as you're writing an email to a person. You can imagine an app for Outlook that's pulling project data from the server. Outside of that spectrum of connecting to Project Server or SharePoint, you can imagine some right in the client functionality addition. We've had some apps already come in that are sort of contextual training information based on which view you're in. So if you're in a Gantt view, they can pull up some information about some best practices for using the Gantt view, resource views, et cetera. We have some apps now that kind of look at your schedule, look at tasks that you have, and make recommendations based on sort of the standard project management standards, sort of like a task inspector, but kind of on steroids, really using more knowledge behind the scenes there. And going back to the online, but not really SharePoint or Project Server, you can imagine bringing some sort of social networking data in and just having that be based on maybe what resource you have selected. You pull up someone's Yammer feed, et cetera, see what they're up to. So one example that is published in the marketplace and live today is Sensei's Task Analyzer app. This is what I was mentioning. This will take a selected task and show you sort of any issues or problems you have with it and make suggestions. It looks like this. That's essentially what a task pane app would look like. The width of the task pane app could be extendable to half of the width of the screen. This is the default width right now, so that's always the standard. You can imagine that that's sort of the best size for you to design your Office app for. But that could be expanded, and your app should probably take advantage of the size it's currently at. And obviously, this one is showing you selected information about the selected tasks, poke around the different tabs, etc. Quickly talk about development tools. I'll show you this in a minute, but you can edit the app for Office in any text editor. Essentially, all you're submitting to the marketplace or all you're shipping to a customer is an XML file that has some metadata like a title and description, and is also telling you what web page you're trying to surface. So if you're trying to load Bing, which I'll show you real quick, you just have Bing as the URL, and as soon as you load that task app in the client, that's what would load. You also call out permissions there, similar to the permissions we had for SharePoint apps. There aren't so many options for apps for Office. There's a full experience in Visual Studio. We have templates just like we do for apps for SharePoint. So this will help you get started. All the info you need is right there. We have a full debugging experience the same way we did with SharePoint apps, and IntelliSense for our JavaScript API as well. So it should be a fairly familiar experience. And I will show you that now. So I'm going to start by showing you just the kind of out of the box what a task pane app would look like, and then I'll actually walk through a scenario that shows the project client connecting to SharePoint Online and servicing SharePoint list data right in the client based on what data you have selected inside of Project Client. But the quick, just kind of high-level overview, new project, same pane as before, go into apps, pick an app for Office this time. The default name is fine. This will ask you which Office applications you want to surface in. I'll just pick Project for now. A lot of the APIs are shared among all the applications, so you can imagine writing one app that works in Excel, Word, Project, and you can submit this to the marketplace as such that anyone coming from any of those applications could download and install your app. So this is essentially creating the manifest in the background, which again is just XML. That will edit here in Visual Studio, could be edited in Notepad or any other text editor. So the manifest looks like this. You can see some metadata. There's an app ID, a version number if you wanted to upgrade it eventually. Your company name could go here. The capabilities is where it's essentially defining which applications it works for. It would say document if this was a Word document, spreadsheet, presentation for PowerPoint. And then this default value is the source. We could change this to Bing. I'll leave it as what it is right now, which is just a simple HTML page that takes the selected data and shows it to you back in a text box. This is just the template. It's sort of a good place to get started. I'm not going to run through the code too much now. But basically, it'll get data. If you click Get Data, it's smart enough to know that we can't set data in Project Client, so that button won't actually surface. All the code for this is coming from the JavaScript file. You can see that this Office initialize function is what runs when essentially the TaskPan app is ready to run. So you'll launch it. It'll kind of get its bearings, know what it's connecting to, and then as soon as it's ready to actually run code on the document, this is the function that'll run. So as you're clicking the Get Data button, it'll show you that. And the set data, again, will not be surfaced in this project app. I'll go ahead and hit Start, and this will launch Project Client. I think that it'll be connecting to the server we have it set up for, so it may take a moment. Again, this is connecting to Project Online right now, but this could just as easily be connecting to a local server or just connecting to a local MVP file. I'll make a blank project. Type in something like task 1. And then the way that you launch Apps for Office in Project is the Project tab, this Apps for Office button, and the Developer App setting is where you'll find any app that you're currently debugging. So as soon as you're launching the F5 experience in Visual Studio, it shows up right here with the title. That'll quickly load in the task pane. And as we click the Get Data button, it shows you task 1. So that's just the template, but that should hopefully give you sort of a high-level view of how it works. The full scenario I want to run through, let me stop this, sort of to follow with Chris's construction theme, would be imagine that we have a list in SharePoint linking a set of permits to a set of resources. So let's say Chris and I are both resources on a project. I have some permits that let me do some work in construction. Chris has some different permits, lets him do other work. And as I'm in Project Client trying to figure out who to assign to different tasks, I need to know who has which permit. And if I wanted to add permits, I could do that right from the client as well. I don't need to go into SharePoint in a browser and see that same information. It's a slightly more complicated app than this in that there's a lot of authentication in the background. You've probably heard about OAuth so far in other sessions. But there's a lot of code that you'll see in a moment that is actually handling sort of all of the OAuth communication, setting similar permissions that Chris had in his SharePoint app, but for this, let me load it from the local page. For this app, it's using what we call on-the-fly permissions. So since you're not actually installing anything into SharePoint, there's no real place to store your permissions there. So every time this app runs, it'll be basically requesting permissions and asking you to trust it from SharePoint. So I'm going to run it real quick before I walk through the code, just because I think it's the really easy way to kind of see how it works. So hitting Start again will again launch Project Client, connecting to a Project Online instance in the cloud, which is, of course, linked with a SharePoint Online instance, where it'll be pulling this list from. The list we have exists at the PWA level in SharePoint. It just has a column for permit name and a column for user. So I'll open a project that just it's a blank project, has me and Chris on the team, just so you can see the different experience selecting each resource. So just a simple construction theme project. You can see we have some assignments on some basic tasks. I will add the app the same way I added it last time. Shows up here, the title is List Display. And so this is going to load. It's going to basically request permissions from SharePoint Online. That'll pop up a window asking if I trust it. This should look familiar from the same permissions page that Chris had in his SharePoint app. We're only requesting read permission from SharePoint, the SharePoint web here. We're not requesting any project-specific permissions. I'll go ahead and hit trust it. The task pane running a client is expecting that permission to come through and then closes that window for us. Has a select a resource. So I'll pop over to the resource sheet. And then this will then, it gets my resource name, converts it to a SharePoint user, and loads from this list. It searches for which permits I have. If I pick Chris, it should do the same. I can go ahead and add a permit. And it's added and refreshed. So that's sort of the scenario we're going for. Let me walk through the code very quickly. Yeah, so this is servicing from the SharePoint list. I can show you the list that it's coming from real quick, just to show that it showed up there as well. So this is what the list looks like. This is where it's pulling from. You can see that permit 11 was just added, and all the authentication was handled correctly. I'm going to go ahead and stop this just for easier navigation around the files. But you'll see this is the same XML manifest. The default value source location is, again, it's the source. We're running this right on localhost. You can imagine changing this URL to some Azure service or even something that your company is hosting. It's just the page that you want to hit as the app loads. And then one thing to call out here is that we have this concept of app domains. Any domain listed here are the pages that are going to run within the task pane app. Any domain that your app hits not listed here is going to be in that pop-up window. And so the reason that window pops up is because we can't predict, as we're submitting to the marketplace, we would not be able to predict what project online or project server instance the customer is trying to hit. That could be whatever domain they're on. And so we allow that window to pop up on its own and just have a hook to it from the task pane app. You can also see that you could set languages here. The permission we call it here is read write document. We could have just called out read document since that's all we're really doing. But those are basically the two permissions you'd ever want to call out from this manifest. To quickly walk through how this code works, you can see it starts with the URL constructor page, which is essentially just a simple page calling our JavaScript. It has a function that needed to run server-side, which is the only reason this is an ASPX page and not an HTML page, to pull the client ID from the web.config, just so we know what we're working with. It'll say redirecting while you're there, but and there's nothing in the code behind page. It just exists again, so we can pull the client ID. The JavaScript is sort of where all the meat of this page is. So you'll recognize the Office initialize function. How we know when the document's ready to go. We go ahead and pull the client ID from web.config, which happens server-side, then bounce back to the client-side code now that we have that client ID. We have a specific API function that's exclusive to project. Since you are connected to Project Online or a project server instance, we can actually get that URL directly knowing where you're connected to. So we're assuming that you want to connect to the same SharePoint Online or SharePoint instance that your project instance is running on. If you saw the demo that Rolando did yesterday of a similar app, he actually had you type in the URL in Word and Excel since you're not really connected to a SharePoint Online experience directly that way. But here we pull it directly from the client. And then the rest of the code is sort of for the OAuth authentication. We take that PWA URL, which is essentially the HTTP and then your tenant name /PWA. Add sort of this known layouts 15 OAuth authorize prefix. This is a page that lets you request permissions on the fly. And so you're going to pass it which permissions you want, and the ID of your app, which is the client ID there, and then these scopes are the permissions. So we're requesting the SharePoint site permission at a write level. So if we're in the SharePoint app manifest editor, this would have been in that same GUI that Chris had, site and then write. Same exact permission. And then this response type is code. This is what the page is going to spit back that the app page that the task pane navigates to next is going to use to authenticate back to SharePoint. So essentially, we're hitting OAuth authorize, asking for permissions. it's giving us a code that gives us these permissions, and then the next page we'll use to actually authenticate. And then the last thing we need is what page we're going to hit next. This is what gets redirected to after we have that code, and is essentially the next page that we need to hit in this app. So this launches that window. We keep a hook to it so that we can read the code from it as soon as we get it, and we know when to close the window. This is working just every second. It's checking to see if that open window has that code yet. As soon as it does, it closes the window, navigates to the next page, which looks like this. It's super simple. It just has a hidden field on it that takes that code from the window that we have the hook to and passes it to our actual functional page, which is list display. This is where all the functional code lives. It has a few hidden fields on it to store the variables that we need for the server, a few labels to spit out the text that we want to display to the user, and list all the permits that the user has, and a button to add if we wanted to add. Similar to a SharePoint app, this code is all written in .NET. Since this code is running on the localhost server, we can actually run whatever kind of code we want here. We're not restricted by not deploying DLLs into the cloud, since we're really targeting our own servers here. I'll step through this super quick, but essentially we are getting a context the same way that we had a context for the SharePoint app. We're getting the same type of context, SharePoint context here, since we're not accessing any project data from the cloud. We take that code, we do a few things to it, and pass it into this special script called token helper. This is what's used for OAuth. We ship it. It gives you functions to kind of handle all the authorization, so you don't need to worry about writing specific code for that. Once we have that context fully authenticated, we have the permissions we need. We pull the resource name from the client API and service that by text. Then we search for the list in SharePoint by get by title, load it, execute it the same way that Chris described. Have a camel query to figure out every item in that list where we match the resource name variable. So it'll pull my permits versus Chris's permits. Get all those items, load it, execute that query now that we want to see the actual items, not just the list, and then spit it all out as a text array that's then serviced there on the client, as you saw. And if for the method to create a new one, same thing. We make sure that the resource name that we have is a real user, to really get their actual user ID that SharePoint can use to add to that user column, since we can't just pass text there. And we take what's in the text box as the permit name, and then update that list item and execute it same way Chris described, and then are good to go. So that's the demo. You saw it already, which kind of ruins the punchline, but hopefully that made sense. It is a little complicated. If you want a similar walkthrough of how all that authentication stuff works, there's a post on the project programmability blog that walks through almost the same scenario. It's the same authentication flow. It uses a slightly different functional app code. It shows you a last modified date instead of a permit list in the end, but that really very slowly steps you through everything you would need to do to get this scenario working from project. I'm going to hop back to slides super quick. We wanted to point out some development resources as you start to develop here. Obviously, the SDK is your best friend, should have most of the info you need. It's constantly being updated. As you probably know, we recently hit RTM, and so a lot of the content that we have is still coming. We're kind of flushing out the articles in the SDK with more documentation, more sample articles, more code samples in our community resources. Sort of the big area to hit for across SharePoint and Office development is dev.office.com. You've probably heard this many times already. This is this panel on the left here, kind of a very user-friendly way to get started. It walks you through setting up a developer tenant. It has all the SDKs hosted right in it, very searchable community code samples. It's really a great place to start. There are forums there that are actively monitored by product team members like ourselves. We've tied some of our content into there, but it is very kind of across Office and across SharePoint. The Project Development Center is much more tailored to us. That's where you'll find our SDK, project-specific code samples. Lots of project folk are checking that out. Frequently, so if you have questions, again, these forums are a great place to post them. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, the project programmability blog, that's where you'll find posts that have sort of code samples exactly like this one. I'll give a shout out to Kia again, who left. He has some posts there in demand management. You'll find all sorts of resources for project developers there. And if you download this deck later, these are all links. You can just click on them and jump right there. Just to wrap up before we take questions, we've kind of gone through the changes in high level and project server and project client that we think were going to affect developers, how moving to the cloud has really made things more flexible for us, and we kind of expect all these great new scenarios to light up. We've told you what's new for developers, mostly with our CSOM and this whole app model and how we tie in there. Some of the more specific things like remote event receivers and our task pane apps. And hopefully we kind of got you thinking about the scenarios that we expect people to hit. We hope people will hit. We'd love to hear what new scenarios you thought of that we would never even dream of. And we kind of hope to work with you all to make sure that we have the APIs you need to cover every scenario that you want to hit. This is just a list of our sessions. As Chris said, he has a session somewhere in this list, Tuesday at 3:15.
20 minutes.
In 20 minutes, that's correct. That's right after this one. I have a session tomorrow.
13 minutes.
13 minutes, good to know. I have a session tomorrow at 10:30 showing some of the apps that we already have published in our marketplace. So what project partners have already delivered for us, you can go download now. They'll talk through some of their scenarios. I'll take questions in 1 second. Just next step slide. We'd love for you all to try development. We want to know how your experience is here. Happy to help, happy to serve as a resource if you want to bounce ideas off of us. Go ahead and jump to that. We're supposed to leave on this slide. We'll take questions now. If you could kindly walk up to one of the microphones so we don't have to repeat the question just in the sake of time, that would be wonderful.
Hey there, I got a question about the changes in the APIs.
Sure.
Is it possible now to, through the APIs, to create parent-child relationships or predecessors and successors, as well as create like a child project? So you showed create a project, but now I create a child project.
No, definitely no to the master project sub-project scenario. I'll say kind of high level that in this kind of first iteration of CSOM, we didn't add a lot of functionality above what was over in the PSIs. So in general, if it wasn't doable in the PSIs with Project Server 2010, it's not yet available in Project Server 2013 in the CSOM. Kind of our first goal was to hit parity with 2010 API, the PSIs, and from there, kind of that's a common ask. It's certainly on our radar, but right now that is limited to the user using PWA to set those relationships.
So the same thing goes for the predecessor successor, if not possible.
I was pretty sure you could do predecessors and successors on update,
You can create a child task, and that's it.
but I thought on update you could create you create it and then you call back, read it, and then you do the update.
I don't think so.
You know, we should probably chat at Ask the Experts. Let me give it a try with the PSI tonight, tomorrow, and then if
Okay.
you're at Ask the Experts,
We'll be there.
I can't remember what night that is.
Tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night, I'll be around that table and I'll let you know how far I got. Because
I'll take you up on that.
yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Sure. Other questions? Yeah, we should have had one in the middle probably.
This is probably an early question, but
Sure.
I'm interested in Yammer and how that can be, how you can develop to incorporate Yammer to be able to allow collaboration and coordination around some ideation and portfolio management. Where you guys are, it's early days, of course, yet, but I'm just curious what's beginning to happen there.
It is very early. I'm not familiar with the Yammer object model, so I can imagine though that it would be very doable given the fact that we've moved to the more kind of web technologies for development using CSOM, and so I think that is actually kind of a cool scenario, and to start thinking through that whole social experience, and I think we're just starting to kind of take all that in. So
Yeah, I think a lot of our goals for this app model was to allow you to use sort of all the other APIs out there and web resources out there and bring those both into the server and the client. So assuming that they have an API, it should be pretty easy to hook into that and kind of merge that with our own APIs, bring those together. But I agree with Chris, that seems like a very compelling scenario. Other questions? All right, so we'll be at Ask the Experts. We'll probably be around the project booth in the exhibition hall at some points today also. Definitely feel free to come see us. If you, again, post on the forums on dev.office.com, we'll see it, respond there. Happy to help as you go forward with your developments. Thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just have one question. If I build an app for either project desktop or project server, can I sell it on the SharePoint Office Marketplace or store?
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. Yes, please.